وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين.
We praise God, the most gracious and merciful, and we send blessings and salutations upon the most honorable of the prophets and messengers, our Prophet Muhammad. Peace and blessings be upon him, his family, and his companions. A warm good evening to all of you present here today. My name is Ibrahim Al-Sakali. I'm the president of the MSA. I will be your host for the evening. I would like to first thank you all for joining us this evening to discuss and learn about a very important topic that's affecting hundreds of thousands of Canadians and over 2 billion individuals around the world. Today we'll be discussing the negative impacts of Islamophobia, the prejudice and discrimination against Muslims all around the world, and how we can do our part to combat this disease in our society. But before we get started, I'd like to invite Umar Latif, a first-year university student, to recite some verses of the Holy Book to get us started with the holiest and best of words, the words of Allah, God, the creator of the universe. Umar, stage is yours.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. إن في خلق السماوات والأرض واختلاف الليل والنهار لآيات لأولي الألباب الذين يذكرون الله قياما وقعودا وعلى جنوبهم ويتفكرون في خلق السماوات والأرض ربنا ما خلقت هذا باطلا سبحانك فقنا عذاب النار ربنا إنك من تدخل النار فقد أخزيته وما للظالمين من أنصار ربنا إننا سمعنا مناديا ينادي للإيمان أن آمنوا بربكم فآمنا ربنا فاغفر لنا ذنوبنا وكفر عنا سيئاتنا وتوفنا مع الأبرار ربنا وآتنا ما وعدتنا على رسلك ولا تخزنا يوم القيامة إنك لا تخلف الميعاد فاستجاب لهم ربهم أني لا أضيع عمل عامل منكم من ذكر أو أنثى بعضكم من بعض فالذين هاجروا وأخرجوا من ديارهم وأوذوا في سبيلي وقاتلوا وقتلوا لأكفرن عنهم سيئاتهم ولأدخلنهم جنات تجري من تحتها الأنهار ثوابا من عند الله والله عنده حسن الثواب لا يغرنك تقلب الذين كفروا في البلاد متاع قليل ثم مأواهم جهنم وبئس المهاد لكن الذين اتقوا ربهم لهم جنات تجري من تحتها الأنهار خالدين فيها نزلا من عند الله وما عند الله خير للأبرار وإن من أهل الكتاب لمن يؤمن بالله وما أنزل إليكم وما أنزل إليهم خاشعين لله لا يشترون بآيات الله ثمنا قليلا أولئك لهم أجرهم عند ربهم إن الله سريع الحساب يا أيها الذين آمنوا اصبروا وصابروا ورابطوا واتقوا الله لعلكم تفلحون
Sadaqallahu al-Azim. Thank you very much, Umar, for the amazing recitation. So the Quran is the holy book of Muslims containing the words of God. It is the manual for human beings. It contains all the rules and laws that the human race needs to progress and live a happy life. It deals with every single issue or topic you might think of in our society and in this world. So if anyone's interested in learning about the Quran and what it contains, and learning about Islam from a non-biased perspective, then we have some material and some Qur'ans at the back that you can grab after we're done. So with that being said, I'd like to introduce our main speaker for the evening, Dr. Navid Bakali. Dr. Navid is an assistant professor of anti-racism education at the University of Windsor, as well as a senior research fellow with the Yaqeen Institute for Islamic Research. He completed his PhD from McGill University in Cultural and International Studies in Education. Prior to joining the University of Windsor, Dr. Bakali was an assistant professor of education at the American University in Dubai. Drawing from critical race theory, cultural and media studies, and post-colonial theory, Navid's research focuses on the study of anti-Muslim racism, also referred to as Islamophobia. Additionally, his research interests include internationalizing and decolonizing higher education, refugee education, Islamic pedagogy, and educational programming for survivors of trauma. His research provides a fresh and innovative perspective on Islamophobia within institutional settings, thus demonstrating and institutionalizations of anti-Muslim racism across the global North and South. Navid has been the recipient of major international, national, and departmental grants and awards in recognition of his work. He's a dynamic scholar who believes in socially oriented action research that challenges prejudice and inequality by combining his research with activism. We're very lucky to have Dr. Navid this evening. So Dr. Navid, I'd like to welcome you to the stage. The stage is yours.
Assalamu alaikum and peace to everyone that's here. Thank you all for attending. So I'd like to just extend my thanks to the organizers of the event, the MSA of the University of Windsor, the Muslim Chaplaincy, as well as the Office of the VPDI at the University of Windsor. So thank you all for attending. I know Monday evenings is not always the nicest time to have an event. If it was an event that I was asked to attend, I would think twice, just because Monday evening is the beginning of the week and you want to just kind of go home and relax a little bit. So thank you all for coming out here, despite the timing and the weather and all that stuff. This is Islamic History or Islamic Heritage Month. So I spoke to the MSA to ask if we can do an event of this nature, and they were gracious enough to agree. So that's kind of why I wanted to do it specifically in the month of October. So in today's presentation, I'm going to talk to you all about a book project that I recently completed called The Rise of Global Islamophobia and the War on Terror. So this is going to be kind of like the broad discussion, and hopefully after that we can have some Q&A to discuss the ideas presented here today later on. So a bit of an overview of the presentation. So I'll do my best to keep it within 30 minutes, just to make it nice and light for us all. I'll discuss this book project and its origins, kind of where it was conceptualized and how we decided to go about doing this project. And then I'll talk about specifically Islamophobia, what is it, how you theorize it, how you understand it, practice it in theory. And Islamophobia in Canada and beyond. So that's going to be looking at sort of case studies around the world that relate to Islamophobia, and then some concluding thoughts. So in terms of where this project originated, I've been a graduate student and an academic for some time now, and throughout my time doing research on the themes of Islamophobia, I've always kind of looked at it from a certain perspective, specifically looking at it from the global north, so Canada, US, Europe. That was kind of my broad understanding of Islamophobia, and even if you look at the scholarship to this day, it's very much overwhelmingly focused on the global north. My perceptions began to change though around 2018-2019. I had the opportunity to go to Bangladesh to visit the Rohingya refugee camps that were set up pretty much after a genocide that took place in August 2017. So for those of you that are not aware, in the summer of 2017, there was essentially a genocide that took place in Myanmar, where about 20,000 Muslim men, women, and children were killed. This group was called the Rohingya. They're an ethnic minority within Myanmar that were targeted really just for the reason that they're Muslim. That's the crux of why the genocide took place. And so this genocide, caused the deaths of tens of thousands of people, but it also caused a massive migration. So 750,000 or more Rohingya left Myanmar to go to neighboring Bangladesh. And so this created the fastest growing refugee crisis in the world at the time, and it's created essentially the largest refugee camp in the world. There's about 1 million Rohingya that are in Bangladesh now that are displaced as political refugees. And I had the opportunity to go to visit these camps. And so when I went to these camps, I was able to speak to the survivors of the genocide and hear their first-hand accounts and so on. And for me, I tried to, I wanted to understand how something like this could happen. A genocide doesn't just happen overnight. It's not, everything is fine and well one day and then the next day there's a genocide. There's a process. There's phases that a society goes through before a genocide can take place. And so I wanted to understand that history and sort of the phases in which this could happen, this atrocity could happen. And so in doing my research on the Rohingya genocide, I began to see patterns in terms of the history of the Rohingya in Myanmar and the discrimination and racism they face. And I saw similarities with the type of research I was doing about Islamophobia in the North American context. So I began to kind of make these connections. And so gradually my thinking around Islamophobia shifted to kind of see it more as a global phenomenon more than anything else. Now in terms of the actual book project itself, this book project is an edited volume, meaning that there's people that contributed. I didn't write every single one of the chapters, but rather I edited the work as a whole, and I was able to get the contributors to give chapters to it, as well as contributing to the work myself. So this is an edited volume. I was one of the co-editors on this book project. And it's the first book, to my knowledge, that covers the theme of Islamophobia across the global north and the global south. So every single continent, with the exception of Antarctica, appears in this work. And so we were able to cover 14 different country contexts. And doing this work, we wanted to give equal space to countries in the global north and the global south. So there's 7 from the global north and 7 from the global south that are discussed in this volume. And we were really fortunate to get really top-notch scholars to contribute to this work. We had, for example, Sean Roberts. He's a scholar that's been doing work on the Uyghurs in China for 30 years. He's one of the world experts on the experiences of the Uyghurs. And he was a contributor for this work. We were able to get Todd Green, who wrote 2 books on Islamophobia in the US. So we got really top-notch, very high, top scholars in the field. And we were able to get contributors from different country contexts as well that have been doing work on the ground in places like South Africa and in North and South America as well. In terms of how this book is organized, we thought that it made sense to kind of talk about Islamophobia through these categories, through categorizations. And so we looked at Islamophobia in settler societies. That's the first category. Settler societies are North America, so US, Canada, and Australia. Those are what we call settler societies in decolonial theory and post-colonial work. Then the second category was Islamophobia from previous imperial powers. So these are European states that have a history of colonizing Muslim majority lands. So that was the UK, France, Austria, and I can't remember now. So there's about 4 from that one, and then we had Islamophobia in former colonies from the global south. So this is looked at specifically at South Africa and the triple frontier region of South America, which is Paraguay, Argentina, and Brazil, and Islamophobia at the breaking point. So this is Islamophobia where there's extreme manifestations of Islamophobia. So this was India, China, and Myanmar. So these were the groupings that we created, and in doing these groupings, we didn't want to kind of argue that there's a spectrum that, in these cases, it's like Islamophobia light, this is Islamophobia kind of heavy or whatever, but rather we wanted to kind of talk about this phenomenon in a coherent way where there's sort of patterns that you see in these different spaces. All right, so in terms of the idea of Islamophobia, how is it talked about, how is it understood? there's different perspectives through which Islamophobia has been explored in scholarship, in academic scholarship. So there's prejudice studies, race and critical race studies, and post-colonial and decolonial perspectives. We kind of situated ourselves in this work in that sort of space between decolonial studies and critical race scholarship. The reason being is because I think colonial studies and decolonial studies really kind of try to kind of see these relationships of coloniality, imperialism, and colonialism in the present context. And so the War on Terror, which is essentially what the book is about, is really a modern day form of imperialism when you really kind of break it down to its essence. And then that critical race scholarship piece, that was useful because people that are scholars of race and racism, they typically will view race and discrimination and prejudice in sort of two realms, or maybe three realms. One is at a systemic level. So these are sort of institutions in society which hold power, so the law, education, government, and so on. So there's institutional forms of racism, and then you have racism that's at the interpersonal level. So that's sort of the everyday things like vandalism, hate crimes, hate speech, and so on. And then some would argue there's also that sort of the cultural realm, but that's very much related to the private or interpersonal level. So that sort of scholarship helped us to kind of talk about Islamophobia in those different spaces in a coherent way. Now, when we get into the actual ideas of Islamophobia, the history of it all, if you want to really break down Islamophobia in its essence, it's really just prejudice and bias or racism, discrimination towards Muslims, right? And if we think of Islamophobia in that way, it's existed since the inception of Islam, essentially. Since Islam started to expand beyond the Arabian Peninsula, when it began to kind of interact and expand its empire into non-Muslim lands, you kind of have these sort of perceptions being formed, right? By the Byzantine Empire, by the sort of European, in later periods, by European nation states and so on. So from the earliest sort of Islamic expansion, you have these sort of ideas formulating around Muslims and Islam that kind of carry over to different phases in history. So beyond that, you have the Crusades, where European armies were coming from Europe all the way to Palestine to conquer the Holy Land. And so in those travels, they have these interactions. And again, the perceptions being formed of Muslims date back to that early onset of Islam expanding into the Byzantine Empire. And so then you have the European colonial period, right? The colonial period is interesting because, colonialism, the essence behind it was, power, wealth, and so on, right? But you need to provide an ideological reasoning for it all. You have to kind of provide an ideological project behind it to kind of justify the atrocities of colonialism, right? And so here is where you have this sort of the bulwark of a lot of scholarship that promotes what we call today, Islamophobia or Orientalism, whatever you might want to call it, is kind of developed in this period of time. You have the post-World War II reconstruction, where you have Muslims that were a part of these former colonies of these European states, now coming into Europe to rebuild and reconstruct the nation. And so again, the perceptions of these outsiders coming in from these colonies, are informing how how Muslims are viewed within these spaces. And then you have the Iranian Revolution, the oil embargo, and so on. Now, if you look at all of these historical moments, it's really you can really kind of describe them as these binaristic sort of relationships between the East and the West, Islam and Christian, or whatever you want to call it. But really, it's sort of a binary sort of kind of conflict, right, between these two sides, right? The War on Terror is where things begin to shift. It's no longer sort of perceived as this sort of East versus West scenario, right? So more and more streamed as a global discourse. How we have typically discussed Islamophobia and the War on Terror, typically, even to this day, it's looking at Islamophobia from a the global North perspective, seeing it as Islam as threatening to the West, right? But this is beginning to shift. The War on Terror has created a context in which you could talk about Islam and Muslims from a very kind of globalized viewpoint, and it's very much related and tied to this idea of securitization. This idea that you need to secure your nation state and your borders from this threatening other that exists. And in this sort of War on Terror, it's created a lexicon and a global discourse around Muslims which have securitized the Muslim subject. And so more and more now, I think scholarship in the field of Islamophobia studies is beginning to shift. I know the work that I've done and the work that others are starting to do now is really kind of looking at this idea of Islamophobia as a global sort of phenomenon across the global north and the south. So I want to now discuss these different country contexts, just to kind of give you a sense of how Islamophobia is indeed a global phenomenon. We'll talk about the global north and the global south. So in the global north, the first chapter in the book that we discuss is Canada. I think Canada is a good starting point because a lot of Canadians, and I think, I've lived abroad, I've lived in different countries outside of Canada, and I think there's this sort of international perception of Canada as being this sort of utopian, multicultural society. And I think a lot of Canadians also buy into this. But people that are racialized, people that are Muslims, people that are from these minority communities, I think they know differently, right? It's not always about how it's promoted. There are issues of race and racism here. So if you look at how Muslims have traditionally been viewed in Canada, they've been kind of viewed or perceived as a non-welcome cultural other. And you can see this really in the history of Canada when you have these immigration laws prior to the 1960s, which really aimed to keep Canada as a white nation. Unapologetically, really, it was very blatant about it too. There was very strict restrictions, keeping settlers from coming from Asian countries and African countries, right? The idea was really to preserve Canada as a white nation. And then, eventually, politically, that wasn't very sort of profitable for the nation, to build a nation. So, then there's loosening up of immigration laws, bringing in people from all parts of the world. But that idea of that sort of cultural other sort of kind of persisted for many generations of years. But in the War on Terror, Muslims are kind of, the idea of them as a cultural unwanted other is shifting more as a security threat. So in the War on Terror, Muslims have become more than a culture, they're more of a sort of security threat more than anything else. And you can see this in two sort of realms, right? You can see this at the systemic level through various sets of legislations that have been passed in Canada. So after 9/11, you have a series of laws being passed, which are anti-terrorism laws, framed as generic laws, not targeting a specific community or group, but have overwhelmingly focused on Muslims. If you look at the people that are sort of the victims of these laws, or the people that are targeted by these laws, they're overwhelmingly Muslims. So you look at, for example, the Toronto 18, the case of the Toronto 18, you may recall from 2005, a group of 18 young Muslim men were arrested on terrorism-related charges. Now, if you ever did your research on that whole case, it's a very clear case of entrapment. Firstly, of the 18, 7 of them had their charges dropped. Like, they were just individuals that had nothing to do with any kind of a plot to begin with. And then the remaining 11, a number of them, they pled guilty for time served and they kind of were released. There's a few individuals that were kind of maybe guilty of a crime. But when you look at this case of the Toronto 18, the key evidence that was procured against them was provided, on silver platter by informants, by CSIS and RCP informants. And these informants were paid very generously for the job that they did. One was paid $300,000, a huge incentive to produce evidence. The other was paid over $1 million. And this is the early 2000s, right? So they were paid massive sums of money to essentially build a case around these 18 young individuals. What ends up happening is that, despite, if you look at the case, you read the transcripts and read the stories on that case, there was evidence against them. But all of the evidence that was produced against them was provided by these informants. So the ammonium nitrate was purchased by the informant. The handgun, the arm, the weapon that was involved in the case was brought in by the informant. The warehouse to store the ammonium nitrate was provided by the informant. So essentially, without the informants involved in this, there's no evidence that existed, right? So really, they kind of constructed a case. And this was a clear case of entrapment, but given the context at the time, there's a lot of sensitivity around Islam and terrorism. This became an unfortunate reality for these individuals, and they, one of them just got released recently. So they served, some of them got life in prison. But if you look more recently, if you fast forward to 2016, a man named John Natal and a man named Kurodi, two converts to Islam, not well educated, they're drug addicts, they're not really informed about Islam. They like to kind of, assert this Muslim bravado of jihad and all this stuff. they get picked up by this informant, again, working for the RCMP. And so they get charged on terrorism related, there's a plot around them as well. They get arrested for terrorism related charges and found guilty. In 2018, a judge ruled that this was a case of entrapment and the ruling was overturned. If you look at this case, very similar to the Toronto 18, but they had the benefit of time, right? They had the benefit of this happening many years later, where there's not as much sensitivity around Muslims and terrorism. Essentially what happened is this RCMP paid informant was coaxing them into doing an act of terrorism. And every time they had second thoughts about it, he would chime in and say, look, if you don't go ahead and do this, your life is in danger. People that are, the people I'm working for, they'll kill you if you don't do this. So they felt their lives were threatened if they didn't do an act of terrorism, right? And so this was very obviously a case of entrapment, right? So this is sort of, you see kind of these systemic forms of racism against Muslims that are taking place through anti-terrorism laws and legislation. Now at an interpersonal level, at the kind of the individual private level in Canada, you have things like hate crimes and so on. Interestingly enough, of all the G7 countries, Canada has the highest number of Muslim deaths as a result of Islamophobia. Again, we have this perception of Canada being this utopian multicultural society, but of all the G7 countries, the most Muslims have died as a result of racism in this country. We had the mass shooting in Quebec City in 2016. There was a man that was slaughtered outside the mosque in Ramadan, I think it was like a caretaker or something in Toronto, and this white supremacist came by and just literally slaughtered him. And then there's a family in London, Ontario that was killed by a car, right? Again, by white supremacists. Now, the relationship here between that sort of systemic racism that you see at a state level, there's a very tight relationship between interpersonal racism and institutional racism, right? The more the state is promoting this idea of this sort of security threat, the more a state sort of criminalizes a group of people, the more the masses in that society that see themselves as the privileged classes in society will kind of feel the need to take up arms and protect that society, right? They want to protect their power, they want to protect their privilege, and these others, these outsiders that are dangerous to us and our families and whatnot, they need to be policed. And if the state's not going to do it, then we're going to do it, right? So there's that tight relationship. The more a state promotes these ideas, the more it will invigorate people at sort of the interpersonal level to engage in these acts of violence, these acts of, well, frankly, even terrorism, right, against Muslims, which are never labeled as such. Moving on to another nation state of France. Again, sticking with the global north. Traditionally, Islam and Muslims in France have been viewed as a cultural threat, just like what we saw in Canada. They were seen as this sort of, for those of you that are aware of Quebec's very similar to France. There's like this obsession with secularism and detaching any sense of, religion in the public sphere from society, completely, discarding that. So they've passed lots of laws to kind of prevent any show of religion in society in France and even in Quebec, right? So Islam has been seen as a sort of cultural threat to France's ideas of laïcité, or the secularism that exists within France. Because this is very core to the identity of the French state. And so there's been the traditional view. More and more, you see Muslims and Islam are being kind of perpetrated or being perceived as a security threat, especially under the leadership of Emmanuel Macron, who's styled himself as a sort of leftist centrist individual, despite his sort of political leanings. He's not a far right candidate or a politician by any stretch, right? But nonetheless, under his leadership, he's essentially criminalized these ideas of political Islam and Islamist separatism. Now, these are terms that are not in any way clearly defined. The terms political Islam, Islamist separatist, what does it mean? No one really knows, right? It could mean everything and anything, right? And so as a result of these undefined, sort of vague categorizations of the Islamic threat in France, this security threat, mosques are being closed, grassroots organizations are being closed, social organizations are being closed, charities are being closed. All these things are being shut down under the premise that it's promoting Islamist separatism and so on, right? So when you have these undefined terms that are circulating and criminalizing them, it creates a space where Muslim agency is basically stripped away altogether. So if Muslims are trying to stand up against these policies, if they're trying to stand up for their basic human rights, the right to be able to express themselves freely in society by wearing a hijab or praying and so on, this can be termed as Islamic separatism, right, or Islamic separatism. And so this can become criminalized. So because you have that sort of historical legacy of France criminalizing any kind of show of Islam in the public sphere, and this really dates back to the colonial occupation that France had against Muslim majority nations. If you read the works of Frantz Fanon, he talks about the French occupation in Algeria. The same ideas were there, right? So, stomp out any visible sign of Islam in society, and by doing that, you destroy the culture. Right? And so the same ideas reflect back, and we see this sort of relationship between that colonial occupation and the way those colonial subjects are now treated as citizens. In any case, so because you have that sort of history of looking at Islam as a cultural threat, now combining that with this security threat, they're being perceived as ultimately an existential threat to French society. And what is it? If something's an existential threat, essentially you want to eliminate it, right? Which is a very scary thought, given that Muslims are like 10% of the population in France. But these are the sort of steps that are being taken. Now shifting over to the global south. If we look at China, the Uyghur population in China. So there's two types of Muslims in China. You have Muslims that are from the Han majority, right? They're less targeted and less vulnerable. But then you have the Uyghurs, which are located in the northwestern province of Xinjiang province. Now, traditionally, Muslims and Islam from this area, the Uyghurs, they've been perceived by the PRC, the People's Republic of China, as a cultural threat. Again, same pattern we see over and over again. Islam is perceived as a cultural threat, but now the shift in the war on terror is a security threat, right? And so, they're perceived as a cultural threat for a reason, right? I mean, if you look at Xinjiang province, it's a settler colonial project, right? These people are ethnically, religiously, linguistically different than the majority. They're different people, right? But they're part of the Republic of China. So they've been viewed or perceived as a cultural threat for many years. But in the war on terror, now they're perceived as a security threat. And prior to this point, when they were a cultural threat, they have to be careful what they do. The world is watching, right? As a security threat, now that's part of that global discourse on Islam and Muslims in the war on terror. And so because you have this sort of securitization idea of Muslims, everything and anything can happen now, right? Everything and anything can be justified in the name of national security. This is just the reality that we live in, right? And so what they've essentially done is they've created these concentration camps that house over 1 million Uyghurs now. And there's forced re-education. There's stories of sterilization. They're doing things in these camps that contravene, that go against the conventions that China has signed on against ethnic cleansing. Yet they're doing them. And this can be justified in the name of national security, right? Because this is a security threat now. It's no longer a culture threat, but they're a security threat. And so to curb the fear or the danger of terrorism, now you can create these camps and they become justified. So now we see ethnic cleansing is being justified in the name of national security. And the war on terror has provided that lexicon, that sort of context to be able to justify these types of actions. More so in Myanmar, where a genocide is essentially justified through this idea of security, right? So again, if we look at Myanmar, space in the global south, Muslims and Islam, the Rohingya population, which is a predominantly Muslim minority ethnic group in Myanmar, they've been traditionally viewed as a cultural threat, right? So again, the Rohingya, they differ linguistically, religiously and ethnically from the Burmese Buddhist majority, right? So they've been seen as a threat culturally to that space, that western province area of Myanmar. But in the war on terror, now they're a security threat, and anything can be justified under that pretense. And so when you have that genocide that took place in 2017, Canada itself has recognized what happened in Myanmar as a genocide. Canada, I believe France as well. And the Gambia has actually taken Myanmar to the International Court of Justice on charges of genocide committed by the Myanmar military. So in this International Court of Justice, when the Gambia took Myanmar to the International Court of Justice on charges of genocide, the then Prime Minister Aung San Suu Kyi, who has since that time been put under house arrest again. She doubled down in a voluntary testimony, saying that conflict, she would call it a conflict, not a genocide. That conflict took place because the military was weeding out terrorists, right? Scorched earth policy, destroying villages, burning to the ground, killing over 20,000 people, forcing a migration of almost 1 million people. This was weeding out terrorism. That's the justification. Again, this is the idea of securitization and security. Under a security threat, everything and anything becomes justified. And so we see this as well in Myanmar, where even the elimination of a people, the genocide of the people, is being justified in that context of the war on terror. And obviously, the world can condemn it, and many people have condemned it, even Canada has condemned it. But their allies, at the very least, can say, this is a legitimate defense. They were beating on terrorists, right? So their allies have something to stand on. Now, essentially what I want to end off here in terms of the case studies is looking at the sort of logic that's developed. It's a really backwards, upside down logic that's developed in the war on terror. I call it war on terror logic. This is what I refer to as in the book. So the paradoxical thinking of the war on terror logic, what does this entail? So this is a little quote from the book. This paradoxical viewpoint imagines terrorism and other forms of political violence as existing exclusively through Muslim otherness, while simultaneously sanitizing blatant manifestations of them emanating from within the national space/subject as a requirement to police the dangerous Muslim. In other words, it's a very convoluted little quote there, but that's how academics are kind of like speaking, I suppose. But to put it simply, right, the idea here is that the notion of terrorism and the war on terror, specifically in the war on terror, the notion of terrorism exists exclusively amongst Muslims. When it's the national subject or people from the majority culture within a nation that engage in acts of terrorism, this happened in Canada as well. This happens abroad, across the board. Whenever someone from within the state commits an act of terrorism, political violence, whatever it might be, it's explained away as either this is a lone wolf, this is an exceptional circumstance, this was someone that had mental illness, right? This is and I'm sure you probably picked up on this by now, right? So the idea is that in the war on terror, terrorism exists exclusively amongst the Muslim subject. That's the idea, that's the logic that's being perpetrated. And given that it's only Muslims that are committing acts of terrorism, the irony of it all, the paradoxical way of thinking of it is that in order to police that, in order to securitize it, in order to protect ourselves from this, you need to engage in acts of state-sponsored terrorism, right? So in other words, to police the terrorist threat, the Muslim terrorist threat, you need to yourself engage in acts of state-sanctioned terrorism, right? So the term terrorism essentially means nothing in this discourse, right? So the idea here is that the war on terror has provided a context for this type of thinking to come about. So to kind of summarize, if we look at Islamophobia across the global north and the global south, the key ideas I think that we try to promote in the book is that there's this very strong link to imperialism, colonialism, and coloniality when we look at the war on terror as it is now. The way Islamophobia is promoted and perpetuated now is very tightly linked in some ways, depending on the context and the historical relationship these countries have to colonialism. It's very much tied to that history in some way or another. The other point to mention is that if we want to understand racism and Islamophobia and racism more generally speaking, there is that very strong relationship between institutional forms of racism and how that invigorates and sort of lights a fire underneath the interpersonal forms of racism and Islamophobia. There's that very tight connection, there's a synergistic relationship, right? It's almost symbiotic, right? So they live off of one another. So the more that these ideas are promoted by institutions across the board, the more it invigorates that hatred amongst the masses, which will feel empowered to act on those sort of ideas that they have. So there's that type of relationship. Now I know I've kind of depressed you a little bit, but I want to end on a more positive note. I think the image kind of says it all, right? So despite the fact we talked about oppression and Islamophobia and all these things, one of the key things we try to highlight in this work is that Muslims are resisting this. They're not just passively sitting by and letting this happen to them. Okay, so Muslims are confronting and resisting Islamophobia in spaces across the global north and the global south. Obviously, you need to consider the spaces in which Islamophobia exists. Places like China, Myanmar, India, there's very little that can be done within those spaces themselves. But you have diasporas of those communities that are speaking out against Islamophobia in those in those states. So you do have resistance that's happening, even though those places that are kind of at the breaking point of genocide and ethnic cleansing, you still have people that are standing up against it. If you look at places like Canada, you have members of parliament that are Muslim, that are advocating standing up against Islamophobia, that are advocating for Muslim issues around the world. A good friend of mine, Senator Zubair, is a member of parliament in the Canadian parliament, and he's advocating for the Uyghurs in this position of power. We have members of parliament in Australia, in the US, in the Senate, in the House. We have Muslim representation. Now again, there's very little that can be done or is being done, but ultimately Muslims are trying to make a difference. They are trying to step up. Beyond the political sphere, you look at grassroots movements, right? You have Muslims that are resisting through arts, education, they're through artistic expression, through poetry, through various means, they're expressing themselves to resist the narratives against them, right? So Muslims are not just passively victims that have accepted the terms of the war on terror that have been imposed on them. They are resisting in whatever capacity they can. This work that I'm promoting here, that I'm talking about, is a form of resistance. I think all of you here, every day is a form of resistance. So you show up every single day and you try to challenge that narrative of Muslims amongst your circle of friends and your colleagues, right? So there is that idea of resistance. One point that comes to mind here, when looking specifically at the different country contexts. So the chapter that looked at the Triple Frontier region in South America, right? So this is Paraguay, Brazil, and Argentina. There was this sort of American media discourse around that region as being a terrorist sanctuary, right? Which kind of was pushing for this idea of securitizing that land, that area. And this was done very strategically because that area is very rich in natural resources, right? So the Islamophobia promoted in that region of the Triple Frontier in South America was very much aimed at preserving imperial interests, outside interests, that wanted to usurp that land. And the people of that region in those countries, they recognized that. And so this sparked a massive grassroots movement, Muslims and non-Muslims, to take back that land and to counter that narrative that this is a terrorist sanctuary. These are communities that have been living in peace for generations. And how dare you come here and say that it's a terrorist sanctuary? They challenged that discourse, and they created like a cultural affair around this, and there's a lot of political movement around it as well. So that's just one example, and there's many other examples of how Muslims are resisting. So Muslims are more and more seeking to define themselves. They don't want to have these definitions imposed on them, especially on the context of war and terror. They're resisting, right? And so I think this is one thing to be very proud of. I think anyone that works in the field of race and racism knows that, or would kind of argue that racism is something that there's no end in sight really. Some would argue that it will exist as long as humans exist, right? Because there will always be people that are in positions of power that want to preserve their power, so they'll perpetuate ideas around other peoples that are these outgroups to keep their privilege and power. And so ultimately, it's not about ending, these things because they'll persist, but it's about challenging them, dismantling them, working towards positive change as much as you can. And so I think Muslims more and more are doing that. So we'll end it on that note over there. So hopefully we were able to keep within, I think we're 30 minutes. So that was what I said we would do, so we're there. So I think we can open up for comments from the chaplaincy, and then we'll have some Q&A. So thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bakali, for the amazing presentation. It's truly unacceptable to see what's happening to Muslims all around the world, and we have to take our part and do our part to see what we can do in our university, in our jobs, and our friends to make sure that we dismantle, as Dr. Navid has been saying throughout this presentation. So with that, I'd like to open up for questions right now. So you can see that you have QR codes at each table. So please scan these and submit any questions, and then Dr. Bakali and Sheikh Hassan will go through them and we'll answer all these questions for you.
being specifically attacked or overlooked?
So, yeah, I think to answer that, it would probably take the rest of tonight and all of tomorrow to answer that question. It's complex, I think. One thing that I can say though, more and more, I think conflicts throughout history, and more we see this now, the heart or the root of these conflicts, a lot of them are kind of spurred on by what I refer to as supremacist ideology. Okay, so when you have this growth of supremacist ideologies, whether it's white supremacism, we see that in North America and in Europe and so on, whether it's Burmese supremacism, which is what we see in Myanmar, whether it's Hindutva, which is what we see in India. These forms of thinking, these ideologies, which really kind of see a land and a place having an identity that's exclusive to them at the exclusion of others. This is where this is the heart of a lot of conflicts around the world, not just against Muslims, but against people that are minorities within those lands. So really, at the heart of a lot of the conflicts that we see in the world today are the growth of far-right ideology that's nativist in nature, that's supremacist in nature. This is kind of at the heart of it. So by understanding that, you can understand the reasoning behind a lot of conflicts around the world. Beyond that, and that's not to explain all of these issues, but you also have sort of the geopolitical realities of these places. So the whole point in talking about the different country contexts is to highlight how there's a history of conflict with these minority groups in these different lands. So whenever a group is perceived as a threat in some way, they get targeted by the state, and so on. And so when I think there's other issues at play, when there's economic factors, when there's other difficulties in society, it's very easy to kind of look for people to blame, scapegoats, and so on. So it's a multifaceted reasoning behind why this is happening to so many Muslim communities around the world. I mean, Muslims represent almost a fourth of the world's population. And yes, Muslims are a majority in the Middle East, in parts of Asia, and parts of Africa, but they're minorities in a lot of countries. So minorities in general, in this growing atmosphere of far-right ideologies and supremacist ideologies, become vulnerable and become victims, as well as other minority groups. So yeah, I think maybe I'll just leave it there, where the idea is that it's complex. And Muslims are minorities in a lot of these places where they are targeted. And there's a growth of far-right ideologies and supremacist ideologies that are kind of springing about in those places that we talked about.
Jazakallah khairan. What is the best way to combat Islamophobia as a Muslim?
So just like how we talked about in terms of how racism exists kind of in two spheres. You have the sort of systemic racism that exists, which is through institutions, schools, the law, government, and so on. And then you have the sort of interpersonal sphere, which is kind of just the private sphere, just individuals and so on. And I think the approach is different depending on where it is you want to try to dismantle and confront some Islamophobia. At an interpersonal level, you being model citizens, you contributing to society in a meaningful way, having interactions with people that don't know Muslims, providing a good example. This is the essence of how you change the perceptions of Islamic Muslims. It's through yourself, through your example. And this is you can see this even for those I think most of us are Muslim here. From the seerah of the Prophet, this was essentially what he so many hearts were turned just for this example, right? And so this is how I think at an interpersonal level, it's just showing your Islam. Now I understand that this could be a bit of a burden as well, right? I mean, this idea of having to always be the representative voice of your community. No one should have to do that. And I'm not assuming that I'm not saying that that's your responsibility. But what I am saying is, your example has a lot of impact. So take that into consideration. Now, when it comes to sort of the systemic factors, this requires mobilization at a grassroots level, lobbying politically, being involved in these institutions which have power in society, right? So becoming, educators, becoming people that are involved or can lobby against politicians and so on. Being in those positions in society and through institutions, you can impact those institutions to advocate for your rights. And that's what communities do. Organized communities, they have an impactful voice through these institutions. I don't want to name specific communities just because we're in the university and there's certain communities that if you talk about them, you'll get in trouble. But all that to say that various communities, they can mobilize and they can lobby through institutions, and Muslims need to become like that. We need to start organizing and advocate on our behalf, because if we don't, no one will really. So I think it's important to kind of look at it from both those perspectives. At an institutional level, there's action that's needed, that's required, and at an interpersonal level. And whatever works best for you, focus on that and do that. Ultimately, we can't do everything ourselves. So focus on what you can do, right? And if it's just being that example to your neighbor, to your friends, whatever it is, you don't have to be the example to the whole society, but whatever your sphere of influence is, try to impact that. And if you're in a position of power, if you can make a difference at an institutional level, then try to do that. It's really what your capacity is, what you can do, and what your abilities are.
Have you noticed in your research that a country has changed its narrative on Muslims and is more positive now?
I think that it really depends who you ask. So, some people have, they literally have had their lives turned upside down because of the politics and the laws that have been passed in different countries. The co-editor of this book, for example, his name is Farid Hafiz. He's a top-notch academic, really smart guy, political advocate, and so on. He lived in Austria, and he grew up there. He was born there. He grew up there, and essentially there's a ISIL or ISIS-inspired terrorist attack where some random guy took a knife and killed a few people in the name of Islam, right? And so obviously the logic there is that, oh, a Muslim did it, it's the fault of all Muslims, right? And so the government had to kind of provide a show that they're doing something to confront the fear or the problem of Islamic terrorism, despite the fact that white far-right groups are the biggest terrorists in Europe and North America. But they have to make a show when it comes to Muslims, right? And so they went on this massive campaign where they arrested 30 people. They didn't charge them, they arrested them to show that the state is handling these extremists, right? And my friend, the co-editor for this book, was one of the people that they arrested. Now they had no evidence against him, right? But they were able to arrest him, seize his assets, and essentially force him to leave Austria. He lives in the US now. So it depends on who you ask. Some people will tell you that nothing's changed, it's only gotten worse. But again, there are stories of positive change, right? I think Australia, we saw recently a woman MP get elected. Muslims are again, through arts-based resistance, and I can see it more and more in North American context, Muslims are expressing themselves, providing a counter-narrative through the arts. So there are sort of things that are happening. I think there's more mobilization, more movement now than I've ever seen in the past, because Muslims are beginning to see the need for it, right? So only time will really tell, and I think it really depends on who you ask, because, thankfully, alhamdulillah, I've never been targeted for anything because of my Muslim identity, and so I can say things are lovely and wonderful. But for those people that have been targeted, it's a very different story. So it's hard for me to really kind of say, but what I can comment on is that I'm seeing a lot more work to confront and dismantle Islamophobia than ever before in different spaces. So that's a positive sign. So take it for what it is.
How to fight Islamophobia by our generations? Should we join journalism and participate through media?
Yeah, I think that is. It's a very. I think that's very important for sure. You have to kind of see what the narratives are that are forming cultural knowledge of Muslims. So for sure, media, films, and all these things, they really kind of do a number on Muslims, right? They really kind of paint this image of Muslims that has a massive cultural impact. So for sure, I think getting involved in these sort of spaces is important. Again, I don't advocate that it's as simple as that, though. I do believe that there are certain power structures in place which are aimed at preserving privilege and power in society, and that's really at the heart of the issue. But culturally speaking, these things do have an impact, and they can have a positive impact. So not to advocate for or against, the different sort of TV shows that have popped up that, there's a show on Netflix that came up called Mo. It's about this Palestinian comedian guy, and sort of it. Now, again, I'm not advocating for or against that show, but what's interesting to me is that a man who's of Palestinian heritage can talk about the challenges that Palestinians face in Western societies. That's something that they've never done before, and that could potentially have an impact on how people view that sort of conflict. The media narrative around that conflict, right? If you look at human rights organizations, more and more now, they're unapologetic about calling what's happening apartheid, right? So these cultural sort of institutions, they are important in terms of shifting, I think, popular narratives and ideas. But again, keep in mind that there are structures that try to preserve power in society, and that it can be a challenge in facing that. So I think it's important for Muslims to get involved in the media for sure, and different spaces of cultural production for sure.
Yeah, this is the same. So a close question to that. Is it true that technology plays an important role in Islamophobia?
I think that technology plays an important role in communication now, right? So all the communication that we have around the world now is through these platforms and the technology that we work with, right? So there are very concerted efforts by lobbyist groups, to propagate ideas that are, there's a scholar named Jasmine Zinn, based out of Victoria University. She's recently published a 300-page report called Islamophobia industry in Canada, and that details how various institutions, through the use of social media platforms and so on, are promoting anti-Muslim hate. Right? So it is a very serious issue. It is a very serious concern because these platforms have the ability and power to reach millions of people from around the world, right? And I think that the idea of this, global Islamophobia very much relates to this idea of technology that this world of technology that we live in. It's more and more becoming sort of a globalized world that we live in that is interconnected. The barriers that we have that exist now are almost, they cease to exist, right? So you have that sort of digital space now which doesn't have borders. And so the messaging in those spaces is very important. So yeah, for sure, it does play a key role.
How can visible Muslims, hijabi sisters, feel safe, protect themselves without paranoia?
This is a very serious concern. My mother, my wife, they are all visible Muslims that wear hijab, and it is for sure a concern. And in doing my research, I have heard lots of stories of Muslim women being harassed and physically abused because they're visibly Muslim. There's no real easy solutions to this. I think when it comes to your personal safety, obviously there's things you can do. Walk in groups with people if you're avoid being alone, especially at night. Walking the streets. This is kind of good advice I think for people in general. The University of Uwindsor had a recent stalker / predator that was arrested, right? So but I don't think that fear should control and dictate everything you do. I think that if again, I don't have to wear the hijab, and I can't say that just suck it up and that's not my place. I admire because there's courage. It takes courage to be visible and Muslim and visible for whatever you believe in, right? It does take courage, and I commend Muslims that do wear the hijab because I know it's not easy. I have a wife, I have a mother, and I have family that wears the hijab. And I know it can be difficult. Really, you need to look at your circumstances and your personal safety, and always the primary concern should be your safety. So make sure that you're safe and protect yourself as much as you can. But don't let that fear dictate everything that you can do. You live in a free society. You live in a country where you have rights, and you want to kind of exercise those rights. So don't, be careful, but ultimately I think we shouldn't let fear dictate our lives. We shouldn't live in fear. That's no way you live. But again, be safe and inshallah just, take care of yourselves. That's the best I can do. There's no easy answers to that.
On that, how can Muslims change their behavior to minimize criticism from the non-Muslims?
I think just being authentic to yourself and don't be overly concerned about the criticisms. I don't think we should have to appease everyone else. You need to be authentic to yourself. Otherwise, you're putting on a show. It's all performative. Be who you are, and don't be afraid to be who you are. Again, you live in a society where you have rights, and your rights are, and you're allowed to express those things. But again, just having that sort of character that's encouraged in Islam, that can have so much of an impact on people. If you just read the stories from the Sirah of the Prophet, what more can you say? This man, he would pray for the people that would harass him every single day, throw dirt at him, people that would do the worst things to him, and he would pray for them. And he wouldn't, when he was in a position of power, when he could have gotten rid of every single one of them, he chose to forgive them, So that character, that, having that sort of, character has a huge impact on people. So display that character as much as you can. It's not easy for us, we're nowhere near there. But as much as you can, just be true to yourself and be true to your Muslim identity. That's going to have a huge impact, I think. And again, I don't think we should be trying to be performative. I don't think we need to change who we are to appease others. We need to show people who we are. They'll respect you more for that too. When you're authentic, people will have more respect for you. So be true to yourself and do your best to show that character which you believe is authentic to Islam and yourself.
I'm gonna talk about the scary word, Sharia law. There's this question here, and this is always on the mind of every Muslim when the word is, thrown out. A lot of non-Muslims seem to misunderstand the word Sharia law and think that it has to do something with political agenda of Islam or war. How would you explain it to non-Muslim, or how we are supposed to explain it so that people can understand it?
So I'll give my thoughts, and I think you should chime in on this as well. So I think that again, I think when you're speaking to individuals, friends and people you can have a conversation with, you can really break this down in a very detailed way, right? Because Sharia encompasses essentially everything and anything Muslim does, right? So obviously there's the laws of Islam, which are a penal code and so on. But the Sharia encompasses how you pray, how you clean yourself when you go to the bathroom. These are all aspects of it, right? So it's really, I think when you're having this conversation with individuals, you could just kind of talk about how I think the term itself is a buzzword. It's being used for sort of, I think it's just as a buzzword to create this perception of a boogeyman. Because when people talk about it negatively in the public sphere, it's really just focusing on the harshest punishments within Islam. But the Sharia encompasses much more than just that. It's not just that. So it encompasses everything a Muslim does essentially in their life, right? So I think that's one thing to kind of clarify at the outset if you're talking to individuals. Now, when it comes to this idea of advocating for the Sharia and all that stuff, I think that's something that a lot of in politics that's become a big thing. It's to kind of solidify bases when it comes to these nativist groups that are trying to create this fear around this cultural other that's taking their spaces and their lands and so on. I don't think the vast majority of Muslims want or advocate in any way, logically or in any way, in any capacity whatsoever. I don't think Muslims at all advocate for the application of the penal code of Islam in this society. I have never met anyone that does that. yet this is like the big fear, right? So I think that, you know, when you're talking to people in general, the idea is that, okay, well, give me an example of one person that's not this fringe member of the Muslim community that is actually advocating for these things. You know, does he actually represent institutions or Muslims as a whole, or is it just one fringe person that's advocating these ideas? And you know, that's kind of when you're talking to a general audience. And then when you're talking more at an interpersonal level, individuals, you know, I think it's important to emphasize that that term Sharia has been misused a lot and it's misunderstood a lot. You know, it's not just that aspect of Islam. So if you want to ban Sharia as a concept, you're basically preventing Muslims from praying, from all the daily affairs of a Muslim's life, right? So that makes absolutely no sense. So people need to understand what the Sharia is for you to be able to you know, clarify that thing. So I think you need to kind of focus on the different aspects of it and really talk about how it's being misused and misunderstood.
All of it? Or just how many? So take 3 more questions? Okay.
What motivated you to write the book?
So as someone that works as an academic, I'm always kind of looking for things to research and things to kind of learn more about. I've always had a passion about, you know, learning about Islam and Muslims and the challenges that Muslims face and confronting Islamophobia. So, you know, before I even went into graduate studies, you know, I had this sort of passion towards, you know, critiquing perceptions or representation of Muslims in the media. And then, you know, I kind of was just, you know, I had a conversation with a professor and she had encouraged me to go into graduate studies. And so from there on, that kind of started, that was the starting point of me kind of doing research in this field. And I think what really kind of motivates me is that, you know, like I said before, I don't have these sort of, these imaginary ideas of ending racism. I don't think that, or discrimination, I don't think that's ever going to happen. You know, like I said, as long as power exists in society, people will want to preserve it and they'll use their power to kind of, you know, create these differences between people in society to kind of preserve their own power. That's going to happen regardless. But for me, you know, I look at the process and wanting to work towards a better future for myself, for my children, for the next generation. So really my motivation in all of this is to work towards something better. If not better, if I don't see the change or a positive change in my life, hopefully it'll be in the next generation, my children will see it. So that's really the hope in all of this, is to inspire change and to work towards a positive, more positive future.
This is a celebrity here aspect. Do you think Andrew Tate's conversion to Islam will affect the view of the Western people and about Islam and Islamophobia? Do you think it will impact in a good way or a bad way? That was you, Sa'ad?
So Andrew Tate, I just found out a couple days ago he became Muslim. I knew very little about it before he became Muslim. I just kind of had a sense of him. He's an individual. Again, I don't know enough about to really comment on him as an individual. As with anyone that becomes Muslim, you know, my prayers are watching them. I know it's not easy, you know, making that transition. So my prayers are for him. I pray that goodness comes through his conversion. And you know, we live in an age where people are, you know, really, you have people that are influencers. Right? That's an actual thing now. It's like a career that people aspire towards, being an influencer. You know, which this idea didn't exist, I think, maybe 5 years ago. So yeah, people, that's their job. Some people, their job is to influence others. And this massive influencer became Muslim. So who knows, maybe it'll be something good for Islam, who knows. We hope for the best. But again, like, you know, look at people as individuals. No one is infallible except, you know, for, you know, the prophets and something. You know, you have, but generally speaking, Muslims are not infallible. Muslims make mistakes. Muslims say bad things. Muslims do bad things. So, you know, don't put him up on a pedestal and hope for the best. And maybe good will come about from it. But you know, if he does something good, or if he does something good, you know, that's good and excellent, amazing. If he does something bad, then, you know, just maybe pray for him. He's a Muslim brother now. You know, pray for him to make a change. That's good.
So political questions. It's about the head of states of the Muslim nations, Muslim movements, why they're not fighting Islamophobia and helping in, portraying the good message. Again, just so just a couple questions about that. If you can elaborate a little more.
So I live in the UAE. So I lived in Dubai and Abu Dhabi for about 4 years. And I saw things change drastically from the time I moved there to the time I left. And the co-author for this book, the co-editor for the book, he actually wrote a book called Islamophobia in Muslim Majority Nations. Interestingly enough. So he did a co-edited work on that as well. Ultimately what you need to understand is that, and this is kind of getting back to those ideas that I've been talking about throughout the night, this idea of protecting your power and privilege. These are rulers that their biggest fear, especially in the GCC, their biggest fear is political agency of Muslims. They don't want Muslims to have any sense of political agency. They just want them to be satisfied with the status quo because that will protect their power and their authority, right? The second that anyone wants to kind of express themselves in a different way or has a different interpretation of Islam, that becomes a problem for them, right? So if you look at the case of France I was talking about, the criminalization of political and separatist Islam, they're drawing from Muslim countries. They're drawing from the policies of places like the UAE and other places where they've essentially by drawing from them, they kind of legitimize, Muslim countries are saying the same thing. Ultimately, what it comes down to is that these rulers don't represent Islam or Muslims, they represent themselves. They care about preserving their privilege and their power, and they'll do that at any cost, even if it means selling any kind of morals and ideals that relate to Islam. They don't really care for those things. Now, having said that, I lived in one of those countries, and as a country itself, at an interpersonal level, the societies are nice to live in. For Muslims, they're very good. Food is not an issue. Morality is not much of an issue there. But politically, there are issues for sure. And if you have a political problem with the state, if you don't keep your mouth shut, you'll get kicked out of the country, right? So it's for them, it's all about preserving their power and their privilege, right? And so they won't, if keeping quiet when it comes to Muslim issues is in their interest, their self-interest, they'll do that. If making deals with nations that oppress Muslims is in their interest, they will do that. And that's exactly what you see happening. So it's about their personal interests.
One more? Last one? Okay. So, have you experienced an Islamophobia on a personal level? So, how do you deal with it? And what's your advice at the end to on this?
Yeah. So this relates back into the first question that we talked about. It's really, for me, it's just setting the example. I think that the discrimination I've experienced in my life, it's been very much, thankfully, it wasn't kind of things that other people have experienced in terms of the state targeting them and so on. Thankfully, alhamdulillah, I've never had that issue, and I know that can ruin lives, and I've seen it happen to people. I know people whose lives have been ruined from these things. For me, it's just been a blessing that I've had to deal with very minor things, like looks and comments and things like that. I think the most, and again, I don't have proof for this, but I would say when it comes to discrimination that I face probably as an academic, just landing a job as an academic. If you're talking about Islamophobia, good luck. You're really sort of flipping a point on that. So it's really difficult to kind of make a way for yourself if you're going to talk about these things that as an academic. So there is for sure discrimination that I've faced and I've had to kind of live with. But thankfully, it's the kind that it hasn't altered my life in such a way that it's made life extremely difficult for me, and I completely sympathize with those that it has because I've seen it firsthand. In terms of what can you do in the face of all of that, again, like I said, look at what your skills are, what's your capacity, what are your abilities to make change, and make change in those spaces. It could just be that you can make change within your immediate neighborhood, or your family, or your friends. Make change there. change perceptions there. It could be that you can do something on a larger scale. You know, if you can, then God bless you and make it easy for you and try to do it there. Really, you have to kind of see what your abilities are, what your capacity is, and go for that. For me, very early on, I felt that for me to make a change, it was in the field of education. So I became a teacher, and then there was a point in my life where I felt that I could make a change in a different sphere through writing and so on. So then I pursued that. That's really what's behind all of the work that I've done, and I encourage you to do the same. That you look at what is that you can offer, what are your skills, what is it that you feel passionate about, and use that in a positive way. That doesn't have to be overtly, promoting Islam or Muslims. Just making a positive change in society is a very honorable thing, and it's something that is very much in line with Islam. So it doesn't have to be that you're advocating for Muslims or giving dawah all the time, but you could just be a very good contributing member to society, and that could be your role, and that could be your part. So really look at yourself and what your abilities are, what you can do, and make a change within that space.
So thank you everyone for your participation, and thank you Dr. Navid and Sheikh Hassan for your answers. So right now I'd like to invite Sheikh Hassan and officially introduce him. He's the chaplain for the Muslim chaplaincy at the University of Windsor. So inshallah he's going to have the concluding words for the evening.
Assalamu alaikum. Before I start, I want you to stand up. Just stretch a little bit. Just stretch. I know after this rich section and rich lecture, we need some stretching so we can try to re-energize ourselves, inshallah, and before we go to Maghrib, inshallah. You can have a seat, inshallah. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah rabbil alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless our health. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless our wealth. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless our gathering. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless our families. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect us from the evilness, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gather us with our beloved Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Say Ameen. Ameen. We're gathered here for the Islamic Heritage Month, and we were blessed by Dr. Navid and this company, mashallah, and it was so informative to learn about the research and about what he has seen and what he has witnessed and what he wrote in the book. But I'll give you some personal experiences and how to bridge the gap and how to get rid of this Islamophobia. From my personal experience, I work in the States in a big company, and when I walk around, I say hi, salam to everyone, I smile, and I interact. I like to socialize. That's my nature. So one time I'm sitting on my desk, a cleaning lady, she's a white person, she comes up to me and she says, Hassan, I want to ask you a question. She doesn't say Hassan, she doesn't say Hassan, I have a question for you. I said, shoot, what's on your mind? She said, what are you? What do you mean, what are you? I knew what she was asking, but I want to know literally what she's asking for. She said, what do you believe in? I said, I'm a Muslim. The first reaction, she said, no way, you're not a Muslim. I said, how so? Why do you say this? She said, you're always smiling, you smell good, and you don't make a mess in the bathroom. This is a clean lady, very simple. You walk by, she's an older lady, say hi, how are you doing today, what's going on, what's on your mind, you listen to her sometimes, even though I'm an engineer, right? But I interact with her. But look at the things she told me about, 3 things. You smile, and when you look at when you think of a shaykh, or you think of somebody, an imam, or somebody like a religious, you could see sometimes he's frowning upon people when he walks by, as if he's pissed off at every single one in the country. This is what make people
like, this is what fuel Islamophobia, right? These actions, and Dr. Navid said that you have to participate at all levels. And the second thing she noticed is that you always clean, you look presentable, and you don't make mess around you. Because when we go and make wudu, we put our feet in the sink and we spread the water around. I'm not talking about the literal dirty, but we make a big mess, and which causes her to do a lot of work. Another example, my cubicle is right here, and I have another white friend, white colleague, sitting right beside me. And he's looking at me like this, and he's like afraid. Okay. And then good morning, Anthony. How you doing, man? Tony, and then shortcut Tony. And then after 2 weeks, I said, buddy, I'm going to grab a coffee. Would you like to walk with me? He said, sure, let's go. After 2 or 3 weeks, we start talking, and we start talking about, I don't talk about religion, I don't talk about any politics, I talk about sports. So my da'wah, getting into the heart of people sometimes, I talk about sports. Sometimes I talk about celebrities. I'm up to date with all this, like news and stuff like this. So after 3 or 4 weeks, he said, you are the first Muslim I interacted with. And the thing I hear about in the media, I was so terrified you were sitting right across from me. Because every time I look at you, I think you're gonna bomb me or you're gonna kill me. I said, what did you find? And then he said, no, you are a very simple person. I said, you know what? I am the worst Muslim. When you see a real devout, practicing Muslim, you know what? He's way better than me. But whatever you're seeing in the media, whatever you're seeing out there, right? It's wrong. There's an agenda to tarnish and to mess up our image in front of people. What we need to do, we need to work hard to reach out and show them and tell them, even if I have a niqab, you shouldn't be afraid of me. We wore the niqab, even men, we wore the niqab for 2 years. We were afraid of each other. We had the COVID mask, for God's sake, for 2 years. So subhanAllah, they tried to ban the niqab in all these Western countries. At the end of the day, COVID comes and make niqab mandatory in every single one. Why people weren't afraid of the mask, right? But I'm talking about we have to play a great role, especially you, the younger generation right now. We have to work very hard to portray the right message. You are being watched. Everywhere you go, you are being watched. For us, men, we can blend in. The sisters, you have a great responsibility. And always I'm worried about you because they've been attacked. A lot of Muslims have been attacked. If I am in a baseball game or a basketball game, they will not differentiate me between another person because I blend in. I don't have the big beard, I don't have the thawb, I don't have anything. I can blend easily. But for you guys, you are the mark. When you walk, they know you. So if you do something, be careful because you are conveying the message of Islam. Anything you do, anything good, bad, is gonna show negative or a positive effect. Going back to the Islamic Heritage Month, just remember what Islam contributed to the civilization. It's huge. A lot of people don't know this. Muslims invented a lot of things. All the theories, all the electronics right now. If there was no math, no algebra, no calculus, we cannot program anything right now. Right? Ibn Jabr, the alim, the greatest alim scholar in math, he was a Muslim. He created algebra, for God's sake. I'm talking about, if you read about what Islam contributed to civilization, you will see how much contribution we did. Whether in medicine, all the tools for surgeries, whether astronomy, if you go and see, they built a building, it has windows. The sunshine does not go from the window, it goes during the 24 hours, it goes from, at this hour, it goes from this window. The next hour goes from the other window. How they designed this? They learn.
Flying. Who was the first one to try flying? Abbas ibn Furnas, right? He knew that right there. He was talking about him. Abbas ibn Furnas who tried to fly. Talking about philosophers. Al-Farabi, Ibn Sina, Ibn Rushd, Ibn Khaldun. All these, they were not just philosophers, they were fuqaha, scholars. That's what they got. Even the law. A lot of things in the Constitution is derived from the Islamic law. They don't tell you that. But because of the stereotyping, the hatred, and because they can pick on us, because we are weak, right? They think we are weak because we're not standing up. We're not doing anything to say no. We're not saying no, we're gonna be active. There's communities, we're not gonna name communities, back in the 60s and 70s, there used to be signs here in Canada and the US, no bleep, no dogs allowed. I'm not gonna name that community. That community, you cannot walk into a store because you are part of this community. That's in Canada and US. Go back in history to read. Look at them right now. They are the most powerful community in the world. How did they do that? Hard work and trying to portray the message. Everyone can do that, its job. They went through comedy. Who didn't watch Seinfeld? Probably I'm the oldest one here. There's a lot of comedies out there. They went through the community and they became part of the community from every single aspect. And as Muslims, we have to work very hard. Don't say this is a bid'ah, this is a haram, this is whatever it is. Yes, if you think that it's suspicious, you go back to the scholar, you ask him, what do you think of this? And we give you the ruling on it. But because you read a hadith in Google, and then you said, oh, this is haram because Google says that, and it happened to me. One time I was telling, I'm from a Lebanese descent, and we eat raw meat as kubbi. So one day I'm telling you this brother, and then the brother, he was from Yemen. He's not even from far away. I said, brother, you know what? Taste this food. He said, this is haram. I said, how did you say that? He said, okay, Sheikh Google says raw meat is haram to eat. So don't get the fatwa from the online. Go back to the scholars, and I'll tell you, learn about your deen. Learn about your deen, the best way to fight Islamophobia. When you learn about your deen, when you practice like Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam did, because when we do whatever we do, we imitate Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. When we smile because we get the hasanah. When Rasulullah says, "Tabassumuka fi wajhi akhika sadaqah," when you smile in the face of your brother or your sister, that it's a sadaqah, it's a charity. When Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he walks and he has his misk and his perfume, his cologne, and the Sahaba used to find his cologne after he walked, like in 10 minutes, because he used to smell good. Nobody smelled him smelled bad. When Rasulullah he was wearing his clothes, looked like very clean, very presentable. This is Rasulullah, this is Islam. This is the true Islam we're trying to portray, and we try to bring everyone into it. We want all people to be Muslims. Muslim, it's not a sect, it's not part of people. Muslims is who submit their will to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. From Adam alayhi salam to now, all Muslims. Adam was a Muslim, Musa was a Muslim, Moses was a Muslim, Isa was a Muslim, and Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is a Muslim. All the prophets are Muslim. You submit your will to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you are a Muslim. Inshallah, when you leave today, leave tonight, have the intention in your heart, you're going to make a difference. And you're going to change, and you're going to change the perception, and you're going to fight Islamophobia in every aspect you can do. Social media, Twitter, whatever, Facebook, what is it? So many of them. Tumblr, Instagram, TikTok, but make some good TikTok, not all that garbage stuff out there. You know what? All these things, and by the way, Elon Musk is going to charge $20 a month now for Twitter. So you get it from me now. Khair, inshallah. This is all what I have, inshallah, to say. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward you. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward you for sitting and bearing with us. Oh, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we ask you to forgive us. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant us the wisdom. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله فيا فوز المستغفر. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
showed up and came out for this evening. I want to thank you for your time and your attendance. So before we end the night, we have a lot of baklava, we have tea and coffee at each side of the room. So please feel free to grab some. We'll be over here for like 30 more minutes. So if anyone wants to talk to Dr. Navid or wants to ask us anything about the MSA and what we have, then we're here. Thank you, everyone.